Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly strange history of chocolate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before chocolate bars, chocolate cake, chocolate milk, or the mysterious ability of chocolate to disappear from kitchen cabinets overnight, there was simply a tree growing quietly in the tropical forests of the Americas. The cacao tree. Its scientific name is Theobroma cacao, which translates to food of the gods. A very confident name for a plant that, if you saw it in the wild, you might initially describe as that weird tree with footballs growing out of it. Because that is essentially what it looks like. Cacao pods grow directly from the trunk and main branches of the tree, hanging from the bark like oversized, brightly colored ornaments. Yellow, orange, red, sometimes purple. Each pod about the size of a small football. Inside each pod are 20 to 40 seeds. Those seeds are cacao beans. And every piece of chocolate you have ever eaten, every truffle, brownie, hot chocolate bar, or emergency snack consumed at 2 a.m, began with those beans. But here is the important detail. In their natural state, cacao beans do not taste like chocolate. At all. If you bite into a raw cacao bean expecting something resembling a chocolate bar, you will be greeted by an extremely bitter flavor that immediately raises the question, who in history looked at this and thought, yes, this will definitely become dessert? The white pulp surrounding the beans inside the pod is sweet and fruity, but the beans themselves are sharp, bitter, and intense, which means the transformation into chocolate required experimentation. A lot of it. At some point in ancient history, someone harvested cacao pods, removed the beans, fermented them, dried them, roasted them, ground them into paste, mixed that paste with water, and finally drank the result. That is an impressive amount of work for something that still ended up tasting bitter. But humans have always been curious creatures. The cacao tree grows best in warm, humid rainforests, particularly in the regions of Mesoamerica. It requires shade, moisture, and patience. A cacao tree can take several years before producing its first pods, which means farmers had to commit long before seeing results. So, cacao was never an easy crop. And anything that requires effort tends to gain value. Over time, people realized that these strange pods hanging from rainforest trees contained something unusual, a drink with energy, flavor, and cultural importance. They just didn't realize yet that thousands of years later, the same plant would become the reason half the planet keeps chocolate hidden somewhere in the kitchen. For research purposes, of course. Once people figured out that the strange pods growing on cacao trees contained something interesting, the next step was obvious. Experiment. The earliest civilization believed to have done this were the Olmec, who lived along the Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico around 1500 BCE. They are one of the oldest known complex societies in Mesoamerica, famous for their massive stone head sculptures and for leaving behind just enough archaeological clues to keep historians busy. Unfortunately, the Olmec did not leave detailed cookbooks explaining their chocolate recipes, but archaeologists have discovered something almost as helpful. Chemical traces of cacao in ancient pottery vessels. Residue from cacao compounds has been found inside jars and bowls dating back thousands of years, which strongly suggests that the Olmec were preparing cacao in some form. Most historians believe they created an early version of a cacao drink. The process likely began with harvesting cacao pods and removing the beans from their sticky white pulp. Those beans would then be fermented, a crucial step that begins developing the complex flavors associated with chocolate. After fermentation, the beans were dried and roasted. Roasting made the beans easier to grind and deepened the flavor. The roasted beans were then crushed into a thick paste. From there, the paste was mixed with water. And just like that, the first chocolate beverage was born. Although calling it chocolate in the modern sense might be a bit generous. There was no sugar, no milk, no whipped cream, no marshmallows floating on top. Just bitter cacao mixed with water and possibly herbs or spices. To modern taste buds, the drink probably resembled something closer to extremely strong, unsweetened cocoa, possibly with a slightly sour or earthy flavour. In other words, if someone served it to you today and said, "Here is ancient chocolate," your first reaction might be confusion, followed by a polite but concerned sip. But to the Olmec, this drink was significant. It required multiple steps to prepare, which meant it was not something people casually made every day. That effort likely gave it special meaning within their culture. What began as experimentation with rainforest seeds had become something more. The earliest version of chocolate had arrived. It was bitter, intense, and very far from becoming a candy bar. At first, cacao probably began as a wild discovery. Someone found the pods growing in the rainforest, experimented with the beans, and eventually figured out how to turn them into a drink that was interesting. Not sweet, not comforting, but interesting enough that people kept making it. But once a food becomes valuable, something inevitable happens. People start growing it on purpose, and that is exactly what happened with cacao. The Olmec and later Mesoamerican cultures began cultivating cacao trees rather than simply gathering them from the forest. This required careful agricultural planning because cacao trees are surprisingly picky about where they grow. They prefer warm temperatures, high humidity, steady rainfall, and shade from taller trees. Too much sun can damage them. Too little moisture slows their growth. In other words, cacao farming is less like planting wheat and more like maintaining a slightly temperamental rainforest guest. Farmers learned to grow cacao trees beneath the canopy of larger trees, creating shaded orchards that mimicked the natural forest environment. The trees could take several years before producing their first pods, meaning cacao farming required patience and long-term planning, which is rarely the hallmark of a casual snack industry. Once cultivated, the pods had to be harvested carefully. Each pod was cut from the trunk with blades or stone tools. Inside the thick shell, the beans were surrounded by soft white pulp that was sweet and slightly fruity. This pulp played an important role. The beans were usually fermented while still surrounded by it. Fermentation helped break down the bitterness of the beans and develop more complex flavors. It also loosened the outer shell, making the beans easier to process later. After fermentation came drying, roasting, and grinding. All of this effort meant cacao was not a casual ingredient. It was labor-intensive, and labor-intensive foods tend to gain status. Over time, cacao farming spread across regions of Mesoamerica where the climate allowed it. Communities traded beans along early trade routes, moving cacao from tropical growing areas into cities and settlements further inland. By this point, cacao was no longer just a strange plant discovered in the forest. It had become agriculture, and once something becomes agriculture, it rarely stays ordinary for long, because the next step is almost always the same. Culture builds around it. By the time the Maya civilization rose to prominence across Mesoamerica, cacao had already been cultivated and traded for generations. But the Maya did something important. They turned cacao into culture. The Maya called their chocolate drink xocolotl, a word that roughly translates to bitter water, which, while not the most appetizing description in modern terms, was perfectly accurate. Their preparation process was surprisingly sophisticated. Cacao beans were fermented, dried, and roasted. After roasting, the beans were cracked open and the inner nibs were ground on a flat stone surface called a metate, using a heavy stone roller. This grinding process created a thick cacao paste. That paste was then mixed with water and often flavored with other ingredients. Chili peppers were common, so were vanilla, flowers, maize, and occasionally honey. And then came the most theatrical step. The drink was poured back and forth between vessels, sometimes from a height, to create foam. Foam was important. A good chocolate drink was expected to have a thick, frothy top layer, and achieving that required skill. In fact, producing good foam was almost a form of culinary prestige. If your chocolate lacked foam, It suggested either poor preparation or mild social embarrassment. Imagine hosting an important feast and your chocolate shows up flat. Tragic. For the Maya, chocolate wasn't just something to drink casually after dinner. It was tied to ceremonies, political gatherings, and social status. Kings drank cacao during feasts. Nobles served it at celebrations. Ritual events often included chocolate beverages prepared with great care. Cacao vessels discovered by archaeologists often contain painted inscriptions identifying their contents as chocolate. Some even depict nobles holding cups of cacao, further showing how central the drink had become. Chocolate had moved beyond simple experimentation. It had become symbolic. The drink represented wealth, hospitality, and power. Serving chocolate at a gathering signaled importance. Refusing it would have been awkward. And while modern chocolate lovers might be surprised by the lack of sugar, the Maya clearly appreciated the complexity of cacao's flavor. Bitter, spicy, aromatic, and foamy. Not exactly dessert, but definitely memorable. Chocolate had officially entered the world of civilization, and it was beginning to gain serious cultural prestige. As cacao became more deeply woven into Maya society, it also became something else, a status symbol. Not everyone drank chocolate every day. Preparing cacao required time, effort, and access to the beans themselves. That meant chocolate naturally became associated with wealth and prestige. In royal courts, cacao drinks appeared at feasts, diplomatic meetings, and ceremonies. Nobles were often depicted in Maya artwork, holding cacao vessels, sometimes decorated with intricate carvings and painted glyphs. These were not casual mugs, they were luxury cups. Some vessels were so elaborate that archaeologists can still identify them as chocolate containers simply by the hieroglyphs painted on their sides, which sometimes literally labelled them as cacao drinking vessels. Imagine owning a cup so fancy it announces its purpose to future historians. Chocolate was especially important in elite gatherings. During feasts, rulers would serve cacao drinks to honoured guests as a display of hospitality and status. Offering chocolate was a way to demonstrate generosity and power. It also had an energizing reputation. Cacao contains compounds that stimulate the body, including caffeine and theobromine. While the Maya may not have known the chemistry, they certainly noticed the effects. Chocolate could wake you up. It could sharpen your focus. It could make long ceremonies a bit more tolerable, which is probably why rulers enjoyed it so much. Some historical depictions show nobles drinking cacao from tall cylindrical vessels, while attendants carefully poured the drink to produce that prized layer of foam on top. This wasn't just beverage service. It was performance. Serving chocolate required skill, presentation, and attention to detail. A well-prepared drink signalled refinement, while a poorly made one likely raised eyebrows across the banquet table. Cacao also played a role in important life events. Marriage ceremonies, diplomatic alliances, and celebrations often included chocolate beverages as part of the ritual. It marked occasions, it honoured guests, and it reinforced social hierarchy. Because when something is valuable enough to require special preparation and specialised cups, it rarely stays ordinary. Chocolate had become a luxury of the elite, still bitter, still spicy, but now officially associated with kings, nobles, and the powerful people who could afford to drink it regularly. Not bad for a bean growing quietly in the rainforest. By the time cacao was firmly established in Maya society, it had moved beyond agriculture, beyond luxury, and into something even more powerful: religion. To the Maya, cacao was not just a drink or a trade good, it carried spiritual meaning. It appeared in myths, rituals, and sacred ceremonies, often associated with life, fertility, and divine favour. In Maya mythology, the gods themselves were connected to cacao. Some stories describe cacao as a gift from the divine world, a plant given to humans as part of the creation of civilization. When a crop is believed to come from the gods, people tend to treat it with a certain level of respect. Chocolate was used in religious offerings and ceremonies, sometimes poured as libations or consumed during sacred rituals. Priests and nobles would drink cacao during important events tied to the spiritual calendar. and cacao did not disappear when someone died. Archaeologists have discovered chocolate vessels placed in tombs, often buried alongside elite individuals. Many of these vessels still contain chemical traces of cacao residue thousands of years later. The implication is clear. The Maya believed chocolate was something worth bringing into the afterlife, which says quite a lot about its importance. Funerary art from Maya tombs even depicts cacao trees or cacao pods, reinforcing the plant's symbolic role in ideas about death, rebirth, and continuity. In some imagery, cacao pods appear alongside scenes of the underworld or mythological narratives involving gods and ancestors. It was more than food. It was part of the spiritual landscape. This religious association also elevated cacao's prestige in everyday life. Drinking chocolate was not merely consumption. It carried echoes of ritual significance. When nobles drank cacao during feasts or ceremonies, they were participating in a tradition that connected agriculture, mythology, and social identity. And there is something slightly amusing about that when viewed from today's perspective. Because the same plant once used in sacred rituals across Mesoamerica now appears in chocolate chip cookies. But to the Maya, cacao was far more than dessert. It was a divine plant, a symbol of life, power, and the relationship between humans and the gods. And that sacred reputation would follow chocolate into the next great civilization of Mesoamerica. By the time cacao had become sacred, prestigious, and widely traded across Mesoamerica, people had also perfected the complicated process of turning raw beans into drinkable chocolate. Because the cacao bean does not cooperate easily, you cannot simply pick a pod, crush the seeds, and enjoy instant chocolate. The transformation from bitter seed to ceremonial drink required several careful steps, each one learned through generations of practice. First came the harvest. Cacao pods were cut directly from the tree trunk using blades or stone tools. The thick outer shell had to be split open to reveal the beans inside, surrounded by soft white pulp that was sweet and slightly fruity. Then came fermentation. The beans, still covered in pulp, were left to ferment for several days. This step was essential. Fermentation changed the chemical structure of the beans, reducing bitterness and beginning the development of chocolate's characteristic flavour. It also loosened the thin outer shell around the beans. After fermentation, the beans were dried in the sun. Drying prevented spoilage and prepared them for the next step: roasting. Roasting deepened the flavour and made the beans easier to grind. Once roasted, the beans were cracked open and the brittle shells removed, leaving behind the cacao nibs. These nibs were then ground into a paste using a stone grinding surface known as a metate. Grinding cacao was hard work. The beans had to be crushed repeatedly with a heavy stone roller until the oils in the nibs began to release, forming a thick, dark paste. That paste became the base for chocolate drinks. Water was added, along with spices depending on the recipe. Chili peppers were common, giving the drink a surprising heat. Other additions might include vanilla, flowers, honey, or maize. And then came the final step: foaming. The liquid chocolate was poured repeatedly between vessels from a height, sometimes dozens of times. This created a frothy foam on top, which was considered the most desirable part of the drink. If the foam was good, the chocolate was good, which meant that preparing chocolate was not just cooking. It was skill. A craft passed down through generations, transforming bitter rainforest seeds into one of the most important drinks in the ancient world. Centuries after the Maya had turned cacao into a sacred drink and cultural symbol, a new power rose in Mesoamerica: the Aztec Empire. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Aztecs controlled a vast territory across central Mexico. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, filled with temples, markets, canals, and bustling trade. But there was one small complication when it came to chocolate. Cacao trees do not grow well in the highlands where the Aztec capital was located. The climate was simply too cool and dry. So instead of growing cacao themselves, the Aztecs did something clever. They imported it Regions with warm tropical climates, particularly along the southern edges of the empire, were required to send cacao beans as tribute. Conquered territories often paid their taxes in cacao, delivering thousands of beans to the imperial capital, which meant chocolate became tied directly to political power. The empire did not just consume cacao, it controlled the supply. Merchants known as poshtecha transported cacao beans along trade routes stretching across Mesoamerica. These traders were respected figures, sometimes acting as diplomats and spies while managing long-distance commerce. Their cargo included many goods, but cacao was among the most valuable. By the time it reached Tenochtitlan, the beans had become part of a sophisticated economic and cultural system. Markets traded cacao alongside textiles, food, tools, and luxury items. And in the capital, cacao drinks were prepared in ways similar to earlier traditions, but often with their own Aztec variations. Spices, herbs, and chili peppers were common additions. Some recipes produced a thick, bitter beverage meant to energize warriors and nobles alike. Chocolate had fully entered the world of empire. What had once been a sacred drink in Maya courts was now part of a massive imperial system of tribute, trade, and social prestige. Cacao had become more than agriculture, more than ritual. It had become political. And in the Aztec world, political resources rarely stayed simple for long, because the next step for cacao was even stranger. It was about to become money. By the time the Aztec Empire reached its height, cacao beans had become something truly unusual. They were money, not metaphorically, literally. In Aztec markets, cacao beans were widely used as a form of currency. They were small, portable, and valuable enough that people could trade them for everyday goods and services. Historical records from Spanish observers describe entire market systems operating on cacao beans. A tamale might cost a few beans, a rabbit might cost around 30, a turkey could cost 100 beans or more. In other words, cacao functioned very much like coins, which leads to an amusing realization. For a period of time in history, chocolate was not just something you ate. It was something you could save, trade, and spend. Imagine walking into a market and buying lunch with chocolate. Honestly, not the worst financial system ever invented. Because cacao was so widely accepted as currency, people stored it carefully. Beans were counted, measured, and transported across trade routes like precious commodities. Merchants handled large quantities in woven bags, and records indicate that tribute payments from conquered regions often included thousands of cacao beans delivered to the imperial capital. But wherever money exists, so does creativity. Some individuals apparently attempted to cheat the system by creating counterfeit cacao beans. Reports describe fake beans made by hollowing out cacao shells and filling them with dirt or other materials. So yes, chocolate fraud existed long before modern banking scandals. Inspecting your cacao became important. Despite these occasional scams, cacao beans worked well as currency because they were valuable, but not too valuable. You could divide them easily into small payments, making them practical for everyday transactions. They were also desirable as a drink ingredient, meaning the currency itself had inherent value. You could spend your beans, or drink them, which is probably the only financial system where your savings account could literally be turned into a hot beverage. In the Aztec world, cacao was no longer just a sacred drink or luxury item. It was part of the economic foundation of society. Chocolate had officially become finance, and it was about to attract the attention of a very different group of people arriving from across the ocean. By the early 16th century, chocolate had become deeply woven into Aztec society. It was part ritual drink, part luxury item, and part currency, which is an unusually impressive list of responsibilities for a bean. At the center of this chocolate culture stood the Aztec emperor, Montezuma II. Spanish chroniclers who later wrote about their time in the Aztec capital described Montezuma as an enthusiastic consumer of cacao beverages. According to several accounts, the emperor drank multiple cups of chocolate every day, sometimes dozens. Naturally, these drinks were not served casually. They were presented in elaborate style. Attendants carried cacao in finely crafted vessels, often made of gold or decorated pottery. The drink was poured carefully into tall cups and presented to the emperor with ceremony. Some accounts even claim that the cups were used once and then discarded, a display of wealth meant to emphasize imperial power. Whether that detail is entirely accurate or slightly exaggerated by Spanish observers is debated by historians. But what is clear is that chocolate had become a drink of the elite. The Aztec version of chocolate was still very different from the sweet drinks and candy we know today. It was typically bitter, often flavored with chili peppers, flowers, vanilla, or other spices. The texture could be thick and frothy, and the flavor was strong. This beverage was believed to provide energy and vitality. Warriors, nobles, and rulers consumed cacao drinks for stamina and strength, particularly before long journeys or important events. Some descriptions even suggest that chocolate had a reputation as an aphrodisiac, which might explain Montezuma's enthusiasm. But chocolate was not only consumed by the emperor. Aztec nobles and high-ranking warriors also drank cacao during feasts and ceremonies. Serving chocolate was a sign of prestige and hospitality, reinforcing social hierarchies within the empire. At royal banquets, guests might be offered carefully prepared cacao drinks alongside other foods. The drink's foam, still considered the most desirable feature, was produced through skilled pouring techniques. In the Aztec world, chocolate had become a symbol of luxury and power. It fueled emperors, it rewarded warriors, it impressed guests, and soon it would impress a group of newcomers who had arrived from a continent that had never seen cacao before. Those newcomers were the Spanish, and their arrival would change the future of chocolate forever. While emperors like Montezuma enjoyed chocolate in golden cups, the real power of cacao in the Aztec world could be seen in a much busier place: the market. Aztec markets were enormous. The most famous one was in the city of Tlatelolco, where Spanish observers later claimed tens of thousands of people gathered daily to trade goods. Whether that number was slightly exaggerated or not, the scale was clearly impressive. Food, textiles, pottery, tools, jewelry, animals, spices, and countless other items were bought and sold. And right in the middle of this organized chaos was cacao. Merchants carried sacks filled with cacao beans, carefully measured and counted. Buyers used the beans to purchase everyday items, luxury goods, and sometimes even services. It was one of the most flexible forms of currency in the region. If you wanted lunch, you could pay with cacao. If you wanted clothing, you could pay with cacao. If you wanted a small rabbit for dinner, you guessed it. Cacao again. Markets had inspectors who ensured fair trade, and merchants were expected to maintain quality goods. Since cacao beans were used as currency, merchants paid close attention to their condition. Good beans were whole, dry, and properly fermented. Damaged beans were less valuable. Fake beans, as mentioned earlier, were a known problem. Imagine the awkward moment when someone tries to pay you with a cacao bean that suspiciously feels like it might contain dirt. That would definitely ruin the trust in your chocolate-based economy. Beyond the markets, cacao also moved through long-distance trade networks. Professional merchants known as pochteca traveled across large regions transporting valuable goods between cities and cultures. These traders carried cacao beans along with other prized commodities like feathers, jade, textiles, and obsidian. Their journeys were not easy. Trade routes crossed mountains, forests, rivers, and territories controlled by rival groups. But cacao was valuable enough to justify the effort. In many ways, cacao connected the economic systems of Mesoamerica. It linked farmers growing cacao trees in tropical regions with merchants transporting the beans, and with urban markets where the beans were exchanged for goods. Chocolate was no longer just a drink. It was an entire economic ecosystem. And this thriving system would soon encounter something completely unexpected: strangers arriving from across the ocean. By the early 16th century, cacao was deeply embedded in the societies of Mesoamerica. It fueled trade, ritual, politics, and everyday life. And then, in 1519, something appeared on the horizon that no one in the Aztec world had ever seen before. Spanish ships. When Hernán Cortés and his expedition arrived on the coast of Mexico, they encountered a complex civilization unlike anything Europeans had seen in the Americas before. Cities with massive temples, sophisticated markets, organized agriculture, and, somewhat surprisingly to the Spanish, a population that drank large quantities of a dark, bitter beverage made from cacao. At first, the Spanish did not quite understand what they were looking at. To them, cacao beans seemed like an unusual curiosity. But they quickly noticed something important. People valued them. Markets used them as currency. Nobles drank cacao during ceremonies. Tribute payments included large quantities of beans sent to the imperial capital. When a product appears everywhere in an economy, it tends to attract attention. Spanish chroniclers began recording observations about cacao and its uses. They noted how the beans were processed, how the drink was prepared, and how widely it was consumed. They also noticed that chocolate did not taste sweet. In fact, many early European descriptions of cacao drinks mention bitterness, spices, and unfamiliar flavors. To Spanish palates, the drink was unusual and intense. But the Spanish were practical observers. They understood value when they saw it. Cortés himself reportedly recognized that cacao beans functioned as currency within Aztec markets. In letters sent back to Spain, he described how the beans were used in trade and how important they were to the local economy. That alone made cacao interesting. But something else caught their attention. The drink seemed energizing. Warriors consumed it. Nobles enjoyed it before ceremonies. It appeared to provide stamina and alertness, likely due to the natural stimulants in cacao. To the Spanish, this combination of economic value and stimulating beverage was intriguing. They had encountered a plant that functioned simultaneously as food, drink, and money. Naturally, they began thinking about what would happen if it reached Europe. At that moment, cacao was still entirely American. But that would not remain true for long, because once the Spanish understood its potential, they began preparing to take chocolate across the Atlantic. And that journey would change chocolate forever. Once the Spanish had begun to understand the importance of cacao in Mesoamerican society, the next logical step was simple. Try it. And the results were mixed. Early Spanish observers described cacao drinks as dark, bitter, and heavily spiced. The beverage was usually mixed with chili peppers, herbs, or maize, and it was served cold or at room temperature. To people who had grown up drinking wine, beer, or sweetened fruit beverages, this was a very unfamiliar experience. Imagine expecting something resembling dessert, and instead receiving a thick, bitter drink with chilly heat and no sugar. It was not exactly love at first sip. Some Spanish chroniclers wrote about cacao with curiosity, while others described it with mild confusion. The flavor profile was intense and unusual, especially without the sweetness that modern chocolate depends on. But even if the taste required adjustment, the Spanish noticed something else. The drink was energizing. Cacao contains natural stimulants such as caffeine and theobromine, which can increase alertness and reduce fatigue. The Aztecs had long associated cacao drinks with stamina, especially for warriors and travelers. The Spanish began to notice the same effect. And once a food or drink proves useful, people tend to experiment with improving it. Spanish settlers and missionaries began modifying cacao recipes. One obvious change was the addition of sweeteners. Sugar was already widely used in Europe, and when it was mixed with cacao, the drink became far more appealing to European tastes. Other ingredients such as cinnamon and vanilla were also introduced. These adjustments softened the bitterness and created a more balanced flavor. Slowly, the drink transformed. The cacao beverage that had once been bitter, spicy, and ceremonial began evolving into something smoother and sweeter. At this point, however, chocolate was still a drink. Chocolate bars, candy, and desserts were centuries away. But the Spanish had discovered something important. Cacao was valuable. It had economic significance, cultural importance, and the potential to become a popular beverage far beyond the Americas. All that remained was to carry it across the ocean, and once cacao reached Europe, the story of chocolate would enter an entirely new chapter. Once the Spanish realized that cacao was both valuable and culturally important, the next step was almost inevitable. They took it home. Sometime in the early 16th century, cacao beans began traveling across the Atlantic on Spanish ships returning from the Americas. Along with gold, silver, and other goods taken from the New World, sacks of cacao made their way to Spain. At first, chocolate remained something of a curiosity. Most Europeans had never seen cacao before. They certainly had never tasted anything like it. The drink was still bitter and unfamiliar, and the preparation process was complicated compared to everyday beverages like wine or beer. But the Spanish had already begun experimenting. Instead of preparing chocolate exactly as the Aztecs had done, they modified the recipe to better match European tastes. The most important change was the addition of sugar. Sugar had become increasingly popular in Europe, especially among wealthy households. When mixed with cacao, it transformed the drink completely. The bitterness softened. The flavor became smoother. Suddenly, chocolate tasted far less like a strange medicinal beverage, and far more like something people might actually enjoy. Cinnamon and vanilla were often added as well, giving the drink a warm, aromatic flavor that fit comfortably within European culinary traditions. Chocolate also underwent another small transformation. It became hot. In Mesoamerica, cacao drinks were often served cool or at room temperature. But Europeans began heating the beverage, creating a warm drink that resembled other popular drinks of the time. Hot chocolate was born. At first, chocolate remained a luxury drink reserved for Spanish elites. The beans still had to be imported from overseas, and the process of grinding and preparing cacao was labor-intensive. Drinking chocolate became fashionable among the Spanish aristocracy, who enjoyed it during social gatherings and court life. From Spain, chocolate slowly spread to other parts of Europe: France, Italy, England. Each country adopted the drink and modified it slightly according to local taste. But even as chocolate spread across Europe, one thing remained true. It was still a drink. The solid chocolate bar, the version most familiar today, had not yet been invented. But the transformation had already begun. The sacred drink of Mesoamerican civilizations was becoming Europe's newest luxury obsession. By the time cacao reached Europe in the 16th century, the world that had first cultivated and celebrated chocolate was already changing dramatically. The Spanish conquest of the Americas reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Mesoamerica. The Aztec Empire collapsed after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, and Spanish colonial rule spread across the region. With that change came a transformation in how cacao was produced and traded. For centuries, cacao had been part of a complex system of agriculture, religion, and commerce among Mesoamerican civilizations. It had been sacred to the Maya, currency to the Aztecs, and an essential part of ceremonies, feasts, and political life. But under Spanish colonial rule, cacao began to shift from sacred commodity to global export. Plantations expanded in tropical regions suitable for cacao cultivation. Indigenous farming knowledge remained essential, but production increasingly served European demand. Cacao beans were harvested, processed, and shipped across the Atlantic to satisfy growing interest in chocolate beverages among European elites. The cultural meaning of cacao was slowly changing. For the Maya and Aztecs, chocolate had been tied to myth, ritual, and social hierarchy. It symbolized divine gifts, royal power, and economic exchange. In Europe, chocolate began to take on a different identity. It became fashionable. Aristocrats drank chocolate during social gatherings, often served alongside other luxury goods imported from distant colonies. Specialized chocolate cups and silver stirring tools appeared in wealthy households. The drink was no longer associated with ancient gods or sacred ceremonies. Instead, it became part of elite European culture. Yet the story of chocolate still carried echoes of its origins. Every cup prepared in European courts depended on cacao beans, grown in the same tropical regions where ancient civilizations had first cultivated the tree. The transformation was remarkable. A bitter ceremonial drink from the rainforests of Mesoamerica had crossed an ocean and entered an entirely different cultural world. But the journey of chocolate was not finished. For centuries it would remain a drink, enjoyed mostly by the wealthy. The next great change, the invention of solid chocolate, would not arrive until the industrial age. And when that happened, chocolate would finally become the familiar sweet treat the world knows today. But its ancient past, rooted in rainforests, rituals, and empires, would always remain part of its story. In the year 1254, in the busy maritime Republic of Venice, a boy named Marco Polo was born into a family that treated travel less like an adventure and more like a routine business expense. Venice at the time was one of the richest trading cities in the Mediterranean. Ships arrived daily carrying spices from India, silk from China, and enough gossip from distant ports to keep the taverns busy all night. Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle, Maffeo Polo, were merchants who specialized in doing something most Europeans of the time considered slightly insane, traveling very far east. Long before Marco became famous, these two men had already journeyed across Central Asia, trading goods and meeting rulers few Europeans had ever heard of. In fact, during one of these journeys they encountered the powerful Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary conqueror Genghis Khan. The Khan ruled an empire so enormous that a traveller could ride for months and still technically be inside it. To Europeans of the 13th century, this empire sounded less like a country and more like a rumour. When Niccolo and Maffeo eventually returned to Venice around 1269, Marco was about 15 years old. He had grown up mostly without his father, assuming that merchants simply disappeared for years at a time and occasionally reappeared with exotic fabrics and complicated travel stories. For a teenager in medieval Europe, this was either a sign of a very exciting life or very questionable parenting. The Polos brought back something unusual from their eastern journey, a request from Kublai Khan himself. The Mongol ruler had asked them to return with educated men from Europe, preferably priests, who could explain Western religion, science, and culture. Apparently the Khan was curious about the wider world and was not opposed to collecting knowledgeable foreigners the way other rulers collected rare animals. Plans were soon made for another expedition. This time, Marco would accompany them. At 17 years old, he prepared to leave Venice for a journey that would eventually stretch across deserts, mountains, and empires. What began as a merchant's family trip would become one of the most famous travel stories in history. And Marco Polo, still little more than an inexperienced teenager, was about to walk directly into the court of the most powerful emperor on earth. In 1271, the young Marco Polo finally set out on the journey that would define his life. He was about 17 years old, which is an age when most people are still trying to decide what they want for dinner, let alone preparing to cross half the known world. But the Polo family did not specialize in modest plans. Marco traveled with his father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle, Maffeo Polo. Their destination lay somewhere deep inside the vast Mongol Empire, ruled by Kublai Khan. Getting there would require patience, endurance, and a willingness to accept that the word comfortable would not appear again for several years. The journey began from Venice and moved across the Mediterranean toward the eastern trade routes. The Polos travelled through the ports of the Levant and then inland across the rugged landscapes of Anatolia and Persia. These were not tourist routes with welcoming inns and helpful signposts. Travel meant dust, bandits, unpredictable weather, and the constant possibility that your camel might simply decide it had reached its personal limit. From Persia, the travellers moved deeper into Central Asia, following the vast commercial network known today as the Silk Road. This was not a single road, but a web of caravan routes stretching across deserts, mountains, and steppe grasslands. Merchants carried silk, spices, precious stones, horses, ivory, and occasionally rumours of strange inventions from the East. For Marco, the journey was an education far beyond anything available in medieval European schools. He encountered new languages, religions, and customs. Cities in Central Asia were filled with Persians, Turks, Arabs, Mongols, Indians, and Chinese traders. Markets overflowed with goods he had never imagined existed. One of the most difficult stretches of their trip led them across the enormous Pamir Mountains, sometimes called the Roof of the World. The air was thin, the terrain harsh, and the weather unpredictable. Travellers described it as a place where even birds seemed reluctant to fly. After the mountains came the vast and dangerous Gobi Desert. Crossing it required careful planning, reliable guides, and enough water to survive days of barren landscape. Sandstorms could erase trails, and travellers often depended entirely on caravan knowledge passed down for generations. Years passed as the Polos slowly advanced eastward. What began as a teenage adventure was becoming an epic migration. Finally, after roughly 4 years of travel, Marco Polo approached the magnificent capital of the Mongol Empire, the city the Mongols called Khanbalik, and waiting there was the emperor himself. After nearly 4 years of travel across mountains, deserts, and caravan cities, Marco Polo and his family finally reached the heart of the Mongol Empire. Their destination was the grand imperial capital known as Khanbalik, a vast city that would later become modern Beijing. For a young Venetian who had grown up among narrow canals and crowded stone buildings, the scale of the place must have felt overwhelming. Khanbalik was not merely a city. It was a political machine designed to run one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. At its center ruled the powerful Mongol emperor Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary conqueror Genghis Khan. By the time Marco arrived, Kublai Khan controlled territories stretching from the Pacific Ocean deep into Central Asia, governing millions of people across dozens of cultures. The imperial court itself was a spectacle unlike anything Marco had ever witnessed. The emperor's palace complex included enormous halls supported by carved columns, decorated with gold, silk banners, and intricate artworks from across Asia. According to Marco's later descriptions, the palace was filled with officials, soldiers, servants, translators, and ambassadors from distant lands, all waiting for audiences with the emperor. When the Polos were presented before Kublai Khan, they brought with them letters from the Pope and gifts from Europe. The Khan had previously shown curiosity about Western knowledge, and he welcomed foreign visitors who could provide new perspectives about the distant lands beyond his empire. Marco Polo quickly attracted the emperor's attention. Unlike many travelers who only stayed briefly at court, Marco impressed Kublai Khan with his intelligence, curiosity, and ability to observe and report on distant places. The emperor valued capable administrators and trusted individuals who could travel across his enormous empire and bring back reliable information. Rather than treating Marco simply as a visitor, Kublai Khan eventually placed him in service to the imperial administration. For the next many years, Marco would travel on official assignments throughout the Mongol territories. These missions allowed him to witness cities, trade routes, and cultures few Europeans had ever seen. Life at the Mongol court was disciplined, but astonishingly cosmopolitan. Officials from China, Persia, Central Asia, and the Middle East worked side by side. Multiple languages were spoken daily, and new ideas circulated constantly through the imperial bureaucracy. For Marco Polo, the court of Kublai Khan was not merely a destination, it became the center of his world. Living in the capital of the Mongol Empire gave Marco Polo a front-row seat to one of the greatest cities of the medieval world. The Mongols called it Khanbalik, meaning City of the Khan, while later generations would know it as Beijing. To Marco, who had grown up in the canals of Venice, the city felt almost impossibly vast. Khanbalik was carefully planned. Wide avenues cut through the city in straight lines, something unusual for medieval urban design. High defensive walls surrounded the capital, with massive gates guarded by soldiers of the Mongol Imperial Army. Inside those walls lived officials, merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and traders from every corner of Asia. At the center of the city stood the enormous palace complex of Kublai Khan. Marco later described it as one of the grandest structures he had ever seen. The palace halls were supported by richly painted pillars, and the roofs were decorated with shining tiles that glittered under the sun. Silk banners and embroidered fabrics hung along the corridors, displaying the wealth of an empire that stretched across continents. The imperial court itself was a carefully organized spectacle. Each day officials gathered to present reports, discuss taxation, trade, military affairs, and governance. Messengers arrived constantly with news from distant provinces, sometimes from thousands of kilometers away. Kublai Khan presided over these meetings with an authority that left little doubt about who ruled the empire. Marco was fascinated by the diversity of people at court. Persians, Chinese scholars, Central Asian traders, and Mongol nobles all interacted within the imperial administration. Translators moved between languages constantly, allowing the empire to function despite its enormous cultural variety. Markets throughout Khan Balik overflowed with goods from across Eurasia, spices from India, pearls from the Persian Gulf, silk from Chinese workshops, and precious stones from Central Asia filled merchant stalls. Traders from distant lands came to the capital hoping to profit from the wealth of the Mongol Empire. Perhaps most impressive to Marco was the organization of the city itself. Roads were maintained, officials kept order, and supplies of grain and food arrived regularly from surrounding regions. The government maintained enormous granaries to prevent famine in difficult years. To a European traveller of the 13th century, the city appeared astonishingly advanced. Marco Polo had arrived expecting to see a distant and exotic land. Instead, he found one of the most sophisticated capitals on earth. Life in the service of Kublai Khan was not limited to attending court ceremonies or admiring palace architecture. The emperor ruled an empire so enormous that no single ruler could possibly see all of it personally. Instead, he relied on trusted envoys and administrators to travel across his territories and report back. Among those chosen for this task was the young Venetian, Marco Polo. Marco later wrote that the Khan appreciated curious and intelligent observers. Someone who could travel long distances, notice details, and explain what was happening in distant provinces was far more valuable than someone who simply bowed well during palace ceremonies. Marco apparently proved himself useful in this role. Over the years, he was sent on various missions across the Mongol domains. These journeys carried him through regions that few Europeans had ever seen. From the fertile plains of northern China to the remote trading cities of Central Asia, Marco travelled as an official representative of the emperor. Travel under Mongol authority had one major advantage: protection. The Mongol Empire maintained an impressive system of law and order along its main routes. Merchants and envoys often carried official tablets of authority, allowing them safe passage through imperial territory. This stability was one of the reasons trade across Asia flourished during Mongol rule. During his travels, Marco encountered enormous cities filled with artisans, scholars, and traders. Some were larger and more prosperous than anything in Europe at the time. Chinese cities in particular astonished him with their population size, advanced infrastructure, and bustling markets. Marco also observed the administrative systems that kept the empire functioning. Local governors collected taxes, managed irrigation systems, and supervised trade routes. Officials kept records, enforced regulations, and ensured that goods continued moving across the empire's commercial networks. For the Venetian traveller, these missions were more than government assignments. They were opportunities to explore unfamiliar landscapes and cultures. He encountered Buddhist temples, Muslim mosques, and ancient Chinese traditions that had developed long before Europe's medieval kingdoms had even formed. Each journey gave Marco new stories to bring back to the imperial court, and each report strengthened the trust that Kublai Khan placed in his unusual European servant. What began as a merchant's son, wandering far from home, had now become something much stranger. Marco Polo had become one of the emperor's eyes across the empire. Among the many things that impressed Marco Polo during his years in the Mongol Empire, one system stood out as particularly astonishing: the vast imperial postal network created by Kublai Khan and his predecessors. To Marco, it seemed almost unbelievable that messages could travel across thousands of kilometers of territory with remarkable speed. This system, known as the Yam, functioned as the communication backbone of the Mongol Empire. Relay stations were placed along major roads at regular intervals. Each station was stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and resting places for messengers. Couriers carrying official orders could ride at high speed from one station to the next, changing horses along the way and continuing their journey without long delays. According to Marco Polo's descriptions, these relay posts were carefully organized. Some stations held dozens of horses ready for use. Others included food, lodging, and supplies for travelers carrying official passes issued by the imperial court. Messengers could cover enormous distances in a surprisingly short time, something almost unimaginable in medieval Europe. The Mongols understood that governing a massive empire required fast communication. Orders from the emperor in the capital could travel quickly to distant provinces. Military commands, tax instructions, and reports from local governors moved constantly along these roads. For travelers like Marco Polo, the system was incredibly useful. Because he served the imperial administration, he often carried official tablets, granting him the right to use the postal stations. These tablets, sometimes made of gold or silver depending on rank, acted as passports of authority throughout the empire. With this permission, Marco could obtain fresh horses and supplies at relay stations along the main routes. What might have taken months for an ordinary traveller could be completed far more quickly under imperial protection. The network also helped merchants and diplomats move across Asia safely. Roads were patrolled, stations maintained order, and supplies were regularly delivered. The Mongol Empire, despite its reputation for conquest, created a period of relative stability across much of Eurasia. Historians later called this era the Pax Mongolica, a time when trade routes flourished under Mongol protection. To a Venetian merchant's son accustomed to slower medieval travel, the scale and efficiency of this system were extraordinary. Marco Polo realized he was witnessing an empire run not just by power, but by organization. And the roads of Asia, watched over by the Mongols, had become the fastest highways of the medieval world. During his years serving the court of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo encountered levels of wealth and economic organization that seemed almost unbelievable to someone raised in medieval Europe. In the 13th century, European cities were still relatively small, trade networks were fragmented, and most wealth came from land or local commerce. In contrast, the Mongol Empire managed an enormous and interconnected economy stretching across much of Asia. One of the things that fascinated Marco the most was the use of paper money in China. Under the rule of Kublai Khan, the government issued official banknotes made from the bark of mulberry trees. These notes were stamped with the imperial seal and accepted throughout the empire as legal currency. To a European merchant accustomed to coins made of gold and silver, the idea that pieces of paper could represent real value sounded almost absurd. Yet within the Mongol system, it worked remarkably well. The government controlled the supply of the notes and required merchants to accept them in trade. Anyone who refused risked serious punishment, which tended to encourage cooperation. Markets across the empire were filled with goods from every direction. Silk textiles from Chinese workshops, spices from India and Southeast Asia, pearls from the Persian Gulf, and precious metals from Central Asia moved through trade routes protected by Mongol authority. Cities became centers of international commerce, where merchants from many cultures met to exchange goods and information. Marco described Chinese cities with populations far larger than those of European towns at the time. Some urban centers contained hundreds of thousands of residents, with bustling markets, workshops, and shipping ports. For a Venetian traveller, the scale of these cities must have seemed almost unreal. The wealth of the empire also flowed through taxation and tribute. Regions under Mongol rule paid taxes in goods, silver, grain, or labour. These resources helped support the imperial court, the military, and the enormous administrative system required to govern such vast territories. Even the emperor's palace reflected this prosperity. Banquets held at the court of Kublai Khan included foods and luxuries gathered from across Asia. Silk garments, fine ceramics, and elaborate decorations surrounded the imperial household. For Marco Polo, these experiences challenged many assumptions Europeans held about the East. Asia was not some distant and mysterious frontier. In many ways, it was richer, larger, and more organized than anything Europe could yet offer. For many years, Marco Polo lived comfortably within the vast realm of Kublai Khan. The Venetian traveller had gained the emperor's trust, served on official missions across the empire, and witnessed the wealth and organization of cities few Europeans could even imagine. Yet despite the privileges of life at court, one problem slowly became impossible to ignore. Marco and his family were very far from home. By the time the Polos had spent more than 15 years in the Mongol Empire, they began to worry that returning to Venice might become impossible if they waited too long. The empire was vast but unpredictable, and rulers could change quickly. The longer they stayed, the greater the chance that circumstances might trap them permanently in Asia. Unfortunately for the Polos, leaving was not easy. Kublai Khan valued their service and did not want them to depart. The emperor appreciated skilled foreign advisors, and Marco had proven useful as a traveller and observer. Asking permission to leave the court required careful diplomacy. Their opportunity finally came through a royal mission. A Mongol princess named Köküchin was promised in marriage to a ruler in Persia. Because the journey across Central Asia had become dangerous, the court decided she should travel by sea instead. The mission required experienced travellers who could guide the expedition safely through unfamiliar waters. Marco Polo and his family volunteered for the task. The emperor reluctantly agreed. In 1291, the Polos departed the Mongol capital after many years of service, escorting the princess on a long maritime voyage that would carry them across the Indian Ocean toward the Persian Gulf. The journey proved extremely difficult. Storms, disease, and harsh conditions reduced the size of the fleet dramatically. Many sailors and travellers did not survive the voyage. What had begun as a diplomatic escort became a dangerous test of endurance. After months at sea, the surviving ships finally reached the Persian coast. The princess was delivered safely to her destination, completing the mission entrusted to the Polos. From Persia, Marco and his family continued their long journey westward through familiar caravan routes. Cities and landscapes that had once seemed distant now appeared strangely familiar after so many years in Asia. By the time they finally approached Venice again, nearly 24 years had passed since the day Marco Polo first left home. The world they returned to would barely recognize them. When Marco Polo finally returned to Venice around 1295, nearly a quarter of a century had passed since he had left as a teenager. According to later accounts, the Polo family arrived dressed in worn travel clothes after years on the road. Some relatives supposedly did not even recognize them at first. The merchants of Venice had assumed the Polos were long dead somewhere beyond the edges of the known world. But Marco had returned with something far more valuable than spices or silk. Stories. Stories about the vast empire of Kublai Khan, about cities larger than any in Europe, about paper money, organized postal systems, massive palaces, and thriving trade routes stretching across Asia. To many listeners in Venice, these descriptions sounded almost unbelievable. Not long after returning home, Marco Polo's life took another unexpected turn. During a conflict between Venice and its rival maritime republic Genoa, he was captured during a naval battle and imprisoned. Ironically, it was this imprisonment that helped transform his adventures into one of the most famous travel accounts in history. While in prison, Marco met a writer named Rustichello da Pisa. Rustichello had experience writing romances and adventure tales, which made him an ideal collaborator for turning Marco's long journey into a written narrative. Over time, Marco dictated his experiences while Rustichello organized them into a book. The result became known as The Travels of Marco Polo, sometimes called Il Milione. The book described the geography, wealth, and cultures of Asia in remarkable detail. It introduced European readers to cities in China, the organization of the Mongol Empire, the use of paper currency, and trade networks that connected distant civilizations. Many readers initially doubted the stories. Some believed Marco had exaggerated or even invented parts of his account. Medieval Europe had little direct knowledge of East Asia, and descriptions of enormous cities or sophisticated systems of government sounded suspiciously grand. Yet the book spread widely across Europe. For merchants, scholars, and explorers, Marco Polo's stories opened a window into lands far beyond the Mediterranean world. His descriptions inspired curiosity about Asia and helped fuel the growing European interest in Eastern trade. Centuries later, explorers such as Christopher Columbus would carry copies of Marco Polo's book while planning their own voyages. What began as the memories of one Venetian traveller had become a guide to the wider world. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States already stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. On maps, it looked like a single country. In reality, it felt more like two distant worlds separated by mountains, deserts, and an enormous amount of patience. The eastern half of the nation was crowded with cities, factories, railways, and ports. Places like New York City and Chicago were growing rapidly, fueled by industry and immigration. Railroads crisscrossed the eastern states, allowing people and goods to move relatively quickly. But the West was another story entirely. Beyond the Mississippi River lay thousands of kilometers of rugged terrain. The towering Rocky Mountains formed a massive natural barrier, while vast plains and deserts stretched endlessly across the interior of the continent. Reaching the Pacific coast was not impossible, but it required determination, time, and a willingness to endure some truly miserable travel conditions. Many settlers moving west followed wagon routes like the Oregon Trail or the California Trail. These journeys often took 4 to 6 months. Families crossed rivers, climbed mountain passes, and navigated dry stretches of land where water was scarce. Wagons broke, animals died, and diseases spread easily among travelers. Other people chose a different route, sailing all the way around the southern tip of South America, past the dangerous waters of Cape Horn. This sea voyage could take months and was famous for violent storms and treacherous winds. There was also a shorter, but still difficult option. Travelers could sail to Central America, cross the narrow land bridge of Panama by mule or canoe, and then board another ship to California. It was faster than sailing around South America, but disease, heat, and poor infrastructure made the journey risky. All of this became especially important after the discovery of gold in California in 1848. The California gold rush attracted hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers from around the world. Suddenly, the Western Territories were no longer remote outposts. They were booming regions filled with miners, merchants, and new settlements. Yet the question remained: how could such a vast country stay connected? Moving people, supplies, and information across the continent was slow and unreliable. What the nation needed was something faster, stronger, and far more ambitious. It needed a railway that could cross the entire continent. As the United States expanded westward during the 19th century, the idea of building a railroad across the entire continent began to capture the imagination of politicians, businessmen, and engineers. The country was growing quickly, but its geography still acted like a giant obstacle course. Connecting the Atlantic states with the Pacific coast required more than wagons and sailing ships. It required something bold. The concept of a transcontinental railroad had been discussed for years. Merchants wanted faster trade routes, settlers wanted safer travel, and the government wanted stronger control over the Western Territories. A railway would allow goods, soldiers, and mail to move across the continent in days instead of months. One of the earliest and most persistent supporters of the idea was Asa Whitney. As early as the 1840s, Whitney proposed a massive railway stretching from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. At the time, the proposal sounded wildly ambitious. The technology existed, but the scale of the project seemed almost absurd. The American landscape posed enormous challenges. Engineers would have to cross the vast Great Plains, climb the towering Rocky Mountains, and cut paths through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountain range. These were not small hills that could be casually navigated with a shovel and optimism. They were some of the most formidable natural barriers on the continent. Politics complicated things further. Northern and southern states argued for years over where the railroad should run. Each region wanted the route to pass through its territory, bringing economic growth and influence. As debates dragged on in Congress, the project remained an idea rather than a reality. Then the American Civil War changed everything. With southern states no longer represented in Congress, the federal government finally approved legislation to begin construction of the railroad. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. This law authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad and provided government loans and land grants to companies willing to build it. Two major companies took on the challenge. The Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific Railroad would begin in Sacramento, California, building eastward toward the mountains. Somewhere in the middle of the continent, the two rail lines would meet. Between those two starting points lay thousands of kilometers of wilderness, mountains, and uncertainty. The greatest engineering project in American history had begun. With the passage of the Pacific Railway Act, the enormous task of building the Transcontinental Railroad officially began. One of the companies assigned to this project was the Union Pacific Railroad. Its mission sounded simple on paper. Start in the central United States and build westward until the rails met the line coming from California. In reality, the task was anything but simple. Construction began in 1865 near the town of Omaha, which sat along the Missouri River. From there, the railroad would stretch across the enormous Great Plains. At first glance, the plains looked like an easy place to build a railroad. The land was mostly flat, open, and free of mountains. But appearances were misleading. The region was vast, windy, and often harsh. Workers faced extreme heat in summer and freezing cold in winter. Supplies had to be transported long distances, and the railroad crews were constantly moving farther into remote territory, where towns and infrastructure barely existed. Labor for the Union Pacific came largely from Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and other laborers searching for steady work. Conditions were difficult. The work involved laying track, building bridges, leveling ground, and blasting through obstacles. Accidents were common, and the pace of construction was relentless. The railroad companies were paid partly by the number of kilometers of track they completed. This created enormous pressure to build quickly. Construction crews worked long hours, often racing ahead to lay as much rail as possible before winter weather slowed progress. But speed was not the only challenge. As the Union Pacific pushed westward across the plains, tensions with Native American tribes increased. Many indigenous nations lived on the land the railroad now crossed, including groups such as the Lakota and the Cheyenne. To them, the railroad represented an invasion of their territory, bringing settlers, soldiers, and massive changes to their way of life. Conflicts sometimes broke out along the rail line. Workers and supply trains occasionally faced attacks, and the U.S. Army was frequently called in to protect construction crews. Despite these dangers, the rails continued creeping westward across the continent. Day by day, kilometer by kilometer, the Union Pacific pushed deeper into the American frontier. And far to the west, another company was racing toward them from California. While the Union Pacific Railroad pushed westward across the plains, another group of builders began their work on the opposite side of the continent. The Central Pacific Railroad started construction in the city of Sacramento, laying track eastward toward the towering mountains that separated California from the rest of the country. If the plains posed challenges for the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific faced something far more intimidating. Directly in their path stood the massive wall of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. These mountains rose steeply from the California valleys, with peaks covered in snow for much of the year. Building a railroad through them meant carving tunnels through solid granite, blasting cliffs, and laying track along narrow mountain ledges. The company was led by a group of wealthy California businessmen, later known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They were determined to complete the western half of the railroad, even though the engineering challenges seemed nearly impossible. Labor soon became the company's biggest problem. Many workers initially hired for the project quit when they realized how dangerous the job was. The mountains required blasting rock with explosives, hanging from cliffs to drill tunnels, and working in brutal winter storms. Snow sometimes buried construction camps under several meters of ice and packed snow. To solve the labor shortage, the Central Pacific began hiring large numbers of Chinese immigrant workers. Thousands of laborers from southern China eventually joined the railroad crews. These workers proved incredibly skilled, disciplined, and resilient under extreme conditions. Chinese crews carved tunnels through solid rock, laid track along steep mountain slopes, and worked through blizzards that would have stopped most other construction projects. In winter, workers sometimes lived inside snow tunnels, dug beneath massive drifts simply to survive the freezing temperatures. The Sierra Nevada became one of the greatest obstacles of the entire railroad. Yet slowly, almost stubbornly, the Central Pacific advanced eastward. Tunnel by tunnel, bridge by bridge, rail by rail, the line pushed across the mountains. Beyond those peaks lay the open deserts of Nevada and Utah, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, another railroad was racing toward them from the east. By the late 1860s, the race to build the Transcontinental Railroad had become a contest of speed, endurance, and sheer determination. From the east, the Union Pacific Railroad pushed its tracks steadily westward across the open grasslands of the Great Plains. From the west, the Central Pacific Railroad emerged from the mountains of the Sierra Nevada and moved eastward into the deserts of Nevada and Utah. Between them lay hundreds of kilometers of raw landscape. Once the Central Pacific crews descended from the Sierra Nevada, they entered the harsh terrain of the Great Basin. This region was dry, windy, and sparsely populated. Water was scarce. Temperatures swung dramatically between scorching summers and freezing winters, and the nearest settlements were often extremely far apart. Yet, compared to the granite walls of the mountains, the open desert offered one advantage: fewer tunnels. Chinese railroad workers continued to form the backbone of the Central Pacific labor force. Thousands of them laid rails across Nevada's barren valleys with remarkable speed. Their camps moved constantly eastward as the line advanced, carrying tools, food supplies, and construction equipment across the desert. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific crews faced their own difficulties as they approached the mountains from the opposite direction. After crossing the plains, their route climbed gradually toward the rugged terrain of the Rocky Mountains, and later the Wasatch Range. Construction became more complicated in these regions. Bridges had to be built across rivers and canyons, while tunnels were cut through rocky slopes. Engineers constantly searched for routes that could support rail lines without dangerously steep gradients. Despite the difficult terrain, both companies pushed forward at astonishing speed. Crews sometimes laid several kilometers of track in a single day. The faster they worked, the more land grants and government payments the companies received under the terms of the Pacific Railway Act. Competition between the two companies grew intense. Neither side wanted the other to claim more territory or financial rewards. Survey teams raced ahead to mark routes, construction crews worked late into the night, and supply trains delivered iron rails, wooden ties, and equipment to the rapidly moving work camps. As the rail lines advanced deeper into Utah territory, it became clear that the two companies were finally approaching each other. The vast continent that once separated east and west was slowly shrinking. Soon, the rails would meet. By the spring of 1869, the two great railroad companies racing across the continent were finally approaching each other in the rugged landscapes of Utah territory. The Union Pacific Railroad had pushed westward across the plains and mountains, while the Central Pacific Railroad had carved its way through the Sierra Nevada and across the deserts of Nevada. Now both companies knew the finish line was near. The closer they came, the more intense the competition became. Because the government paid railroad companies based on the amount of track they completed under the Pacific Railway Act, every additional kilometer meant more money and more land grants. This created a strange situation where the two companies began racing each other toward the meeting point. Survey teams from both railroads hurried across the Utah landscape, trying to claim the most advantageous routes before the other company could reach them. Crews sometimes laid tracks beyond what engineers considered practical, simply to gain financial advantage. For a brief period, the competition became almost absurd. In some areas, the companies built parallel lines of track running side by side across the same valleys. Workers from the rival railroads could literally see each other while hammering rails into the ground. Construction crews worked at remarkable speed. The Central Pacific Railroad employed thousands of Chinese laborers who had already proven their skill in the mountains. these workers became famous for their efficiency. On one remarkable day in April 1869, a Central Pacific crew managed to lay nearly 16 kilometers of track in a single day, an astonishing achievement for the time. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific Railroad continued advancing from the east, with crews composed largely of Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. Their camps moved constantly westward, hauling rails, ties, and equipment behind them. But eventually the competition had to end. The federal government stepped in to settle the issue of where the two rail lines would officially meet. After negotiations and surveys, the meeting point was chosen at a small, remote location in northern Utah called Promontory Summit. Here, the two railroads would finally connect. Soon, the rails stretching from the Atlantic states and those coming from the Pacific coast would form one continuous line. A continent that once required months to cross was about to be linked by steel. On the morning of May 10, 1869, workers, engineers, railroad executives, and government officials gathered at a remote location in northern Utah known as Promontory Summit. The dusty plateau did not look particularly historic at first glance. It was quiet, dry, and surrounded by wide open land. Yet on that day, it became the site of one of the most important moments in American transportation history. Two locomotives slowly approached each other from opposite directions. From the east came the train of the Union Pacific Railroad. From the west arrived the locomotive of the Central Pacific Railroad. For years, these companies had raced across the continent, building rails through mountains, plains, and deserts. Now their tracks were about to meet. Crowds gathered around the final section of rail where the two lines would be joined. Photographers prepared their equipment, reporters took notes, and railroad officials stood ready for the ceremonial moment that would mark the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. At the center of the ceremony stood a special railroad spike made of gold. This spike, often called the Golden Spike, symbolized the final connection between the two rail lines. It was carefully placed into the last wooden tie where the final rail would be secured. One of the key figures present that day was Leland Stanford, one of the leaders of the Central Pacific Railroad. Stanford was given the honor of driving the ceremonial spike. A telegraph wire had been connected to the hammer and spike, so that the moment the spike was struck, a signal would travel instantly across the nation. Telegraph operators in cities throughout the United States waited for the message. When the final blow was delivered, the signal flashed through the telegraph network. Across the country, church bells rang and cannons fired in celebration. Cities held parades, and newspapers quickly spread the news that the continent had been connected by rail. The symbolic spike marked more than just the joining of two tracks. For the first time in history, travelers could cross the United States from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean using a continuous railroad line. What once took months of dangerous travel could now be completed in about a week. Steel rails had stitched the continent together, and the United States had entered a new era of movement, trade, and expansion. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, the first Transcontinental Railroad completion did more than simply connect two rail lines. It fundamentally changed how the United States functioned as a nation. What had once been a vast and difficult frontier suddenly became far more accessible. Before the railroad, traveling from the eastern United States to the Pacific coast could take 4 to 6 months by wagon. The journey required crossing deserts, rivers, mountains, and territories where supplies were limited and danger was constant. With the completion of the railroad, that same journey could now be completed in roughly a week. Passengers boarded trains in eastern cities such as Chicago and traveled west across the plains, through mountain passes and into California. The rails passed through remote regions that only a few years earlier had been accessible mainly by wagon caravans. The railroad quickly transformed trade. Goods that once took months to move across the continent could now travel in days. California's agricultural products could reach eastern markets, while manufactured goods from eastern factories flowed westward into growing frontier towns. Entire industries expanded because of the new railway connection. Ranchers shipped cattle eastward, miners transported metals and minerals, and farmers gained access to distant markets that had previously been unreachable. The railroad also reshaped settlement patterns. New towns appeared along the rail lines as stations and supply points developed into permanent communities. Land grants given to railroad companies encouraged migration westward, bringing thousands of settlers into territories that had previously been sparsely populated. Yet the railroad's expansion also carried serious consequences. As rail lines crossed Western territories, the traditional lands of many Native American nations were disrupted. Bison herds, which had long sustained indigenous communities across the Great Plains, were heavily affected by increased hunting and expanding settlement. The arrival of railroads accelerated conflicts and displacement that reshaped the lives of native peoples. Technological change was equally dramatic. Telegraph lines ran alongside the tracks, allowing messages to travel instantly across the continent. The combination of rail transportation and telegraph communication created a faster and more connected nation. For the first time, the United States truly functioned as a unified continental country. The iron rails did not simply move trains. They moved people, commerce, and ideas across an entire continent. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 did more than shorten travel time. It reshaped how Americans understood distance itself. What had once felt like a vast and nearly unreachable frontier suddenly became part of a connected national landscape. Before the railroad, crossing the continent required courage, patience, and months of difficult travel. Wagon trains crept slowly across routes like the Oregon Trail, while ships sailing around Cape Horn endured violent storms and dangerous seas. Journeys that once took seasons could now be completed in days aboard a train. Passengers boarding trains in eastern cities such as New York City or Chicago could travel across the plains, through mountain passes, and eventually arrive on the Pacific coast. The journey was still long by modern standards, but compared with earlier travel, it felt astonishingly fast. The railroad also transformed commerce on a massive scale. Goods moved across the country with unprecedented speed. California farmers could ship wheat, fruit, and vegetables eastward to growing urban markets. At the same time, manufactured goods from eastern factories flowed west into expanding towns and settlements. Industries that relied on transportation flourished. Mining operations in the Western territories could now send silver and gold to eastern financial centers. Ranchers transported cattle to slaughterhouses in cities like Chicago, where the meatpacking industry expanded rapidly. The railroad also stimulated tourism. For the first time, travelers could visit distant landscapes that had once been almost inaccessible. Passengers rode trains through the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains and the deserts of the American West, witnessing scenery that earlier explorers had crossed only with extreme difficulty. But perhaps the most important impact of the railroad was psychological. The continent no longer felt impossibly large. The United States now had a transportation system that connected oceans, cities, farms, and frontier settlements. Messages traveled quickly along telegraph wires that followed the rail lines, while trains carried people and goods between regions that had once seemed worlds apart. In many ways, the Transcontinental Railroad echoed the great trade routes of earlier centuries, such as the Silk Road that once linked Asia and Europe. Just as those ancient routes had connected distant civilizations. To understand the customs of the Mongol imperial court, one must begin not with palaces or cities, but with the wide grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. The Mongols were originally nomadic pastoralists, who lived in a world defined by open horizons, herds of animals, and constant movement. Their homes were portable felt tents known as jurs. Their wealth was measured largely in horses and livestock, and their society revolved around mobility, survival, and loyalty to clan leaders. This steppe culture shaped the Mongol elite long before they ruled the largest land empire in history. The transformation began under the leadership of Genghis Khan in the early 13th century. By uniting previously rival tribes of the Mongolian steppe, he created a powerful military and political system built on discipline, loyalty, and merit. His armies expanded outward with astonishing speed, conquering territories across Central Asia, Persia, China, and Eastern Europe. Within a few decades, the Mongol Empire stretched across much of Eurasia. Despite ruling cities filled with millions of people, Mongol leaders never abandoned the traditions of their nomadic past. Even emperors who governed sophisticated urban capitals continued to value steppe customs such as horse riding, hunting, and communal feasting. These traditions became central features of Mongol court life. By the time of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire had developed a complex imperial court that blended nomadic traditions with the administrative structures of the civilizations it governed. Kublai ruled much of China and established his capital at Khanbalik, the city later known as Beijing. The court there was a fascinating mixture of cultures. Mongol nobles maintained their traditional clothing, hunting practices, and equestrian culture. At the same time, Chinese bureaucrats, Persian scholars, and Central Asian merchants filled the administrative offices of the empire. Diplomats from distant lands arrived with gifts and tribute, while travelers and merchants carried stories across continents. Foreign visitors often found the court both impressive and unusual. One of the most famous observers was Marco Polo, who spent many years in the service of Kublai Khan, and later described the customs of the Mongol elite in great detail. According to these accounts, the Mongol court was not merely a place of political decisions. It was a stage for rituals of power, loyalty, and prestige. Lavish feasts, formal ceremonies, hunting expeditions, and displays of horsemanship all served to reinforce the authority of the Khan and the unity of the empire. In the Mongol world, court life still carried the spirit of the steppe. At the Mongol imperial court, power was not expressed quietly. Authority was displayed through carefully structured rituals that reinforced the position of the ruling Khan and reminded everyone present who stood at the center of the empire. Every meeting, audience, and diplomatic exchange followed customs designed to demonstrate respect and hierarchy. When visitors entered the court of Kublai Khan, they stepped into an environment where protocol mattered deeply. Foreign ambassadors, merchants, and officials arriving from distant lands were required to follow specific ceremonial rules before approaching the ruler. These rituals were meant to symbolize the Khan's authority over a vast and diverse empire. Visitors were often instructed to bow or kneel before the emperor, acknowledging his supreme position. In some cases, envoys presented tribute gifts brought from their homelands. These gifts might include rare animals, precious metals, fine textiles, or objects of artistic craftsmanship. The presentation of such offerings was not simply generosity, it represented recognition of the Khan's prestige and influence. The Mongol court regularly welcomed ambassadors from many different cultures. Delegations arrived from regions such as Persia, Central Asia, Korea, and various kingdoms across East Asia. Occasionally, travelers from Europe appeared as well, including the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who later described the impressive organization of the court. One striking feature of Mongol diplomacy was its cosmopolitan nature. Unlike many medieval courts that focused primarily on their own cultural traditions, the Mongol leadership often welcomed administrators and advisors from many backgrounds. Chinese officials managed bureaucratic records, Persian scholars contributed knowledge of astronomy and medicine, and merchants from Central Asia helped coordinate trade across the empire. Yet, despite this diversity, the central authority of the Khan remained unquestioned. Ceremonial gatherings often took place in enormous halls decorated with silk banners and elaborate fabrics. Officials stood in carefully arranged positions according to rank. Guards and attendants surrounded the emperor's throne, ensuring both security and order during court sessions. These rituals also served practical purposes. In an empire that stretched across thousands of kilometers, clear displays of authority helped maintain unity. Diplomats and provincial leaders returned to their regions with vivid impressions of the Khan's power and wealth. For foreign observers, the court could feel overwhelming. The scale of the gatherings, the variety of languages spoken, and the strict ceremonial rules created an atmosphere unlike anything many visitors had experienced before. At the Mongol court, diplomacy was not merely conversation. It was theatre, carefully staged to remind the world who ruled the largest empire on earth. Lavish feasts were among the most important social and political customs of the Mongol imperial court. These gatherings were not simply about food. They were demonstrations of wealth, unity, and loyalty to the ruler. A great banquet showed the power of the Khan, the prosperity of the empire, and the bonds that connected nobles, generals, and visiting diplomats. At the court of Kublai Khan, feasts could involve hundreds or even thousands of guests. Nobles from across the empire gathered alongside military commanders, court officials, and foreign envoys. Visitors such as Marco Polo later described these gatherings as some of the most impressive spectacles in the Mongol world. The food itself reflected both steppe traditions and the diverse regions of the empire. Mongol cuisine remained heavily focused on meat and dairy products, a reflection of their nomadic heritage. Large quantities of roasted lamb, mutton, and horse meat were served during major celebrations. These animals came from the vast herds maintained by Mongol elites across the grasslands. Milk products also played an important role in the diet. One of the most famous drinks at Mongol feasts was fermented mare's milk, known as arag. This beverage had been consumed by steppe peoples for centuries and remained a central part of Mongol culture even after the empire expanded into agricultural regions. But the imperial court also enjoyed foods from across the territories it controlled. Chinese chefs prepared elaborate dishes using rice, vegetables, and spices. Persian and Central Asian cooks introduced new flavors and cooking methods. As a result, the feasts of the Mongol elite became a fusion of many culinary traditions. Serving food at these banquets followed strict etiquette. Attendants carried trays of dishes through the great halls, while guests sat according to rank and status. Nobles closest to the Khan received the greatest honors, while lower-ranking officials sat farther away from the center of attention. The emperor himself often presided over these meals, seated on an elevated throne or platform. Guests could observe the ruler, but approaching him directly without permission was strictly forbidden. Feasts also included entertainment. Musicians performed with instruments from different cultures across the empire, while dancers and storytellers provided additional spectacle. These performances reinforced the court's cosmopolitan character. For the Mongol elite, such banquets were more than celebrations. They were rituals of power that displayed the wealth, unity, and reach of an empire stretching across continents. Among the Mongol elite, few activities carried more prestige than the royal hunt. To outsiders, it might appear to be simple sport, but within Mongol culture, hunting had deep roots in the traditions of the steppe. It trained warriors, reinforced discipline, and demonstrated the power of the ruling Khan. Long before the Mongols ruled cities and palaces, they lived as nomadic horsemen across the grasslands of Central Asia. Survival on the steppe required skill with horses, bows, and teamwork. Hunting large animals was both a source of food and a form of military training. These traditions remained central to Mongol court life even after the empire expanded across Eurasia. At the court of Kublai Khan, grand hunting expeditions were organized regularly. Nobles, generals, and members of the imperial family joined the emperor on journeys into the countryside where large numbers of animals could be pursued. One of the most impressive hunting practices used by the Mongols was known as the nurge, a massive coordinated hunt involving thousands of riders. Participants formed an enormous circle across the landscape, gradually tightening the ring as they rode forward. Animals within the circle were slowly driven toward the center, where hunters could capture or kill them. This method required remarkable organization and discipline. Riders had to maintain formation across vast distances, sometimes stretching for kilometers. Breaking the line or allowing animals to escape could be punished severely, because the hunt also served as a form of military training. The animals hunted during these expeditions varied depending on the region. Deer, wild horses, antelope, and even wolves might be pursued. Falcons and trained hunting birds were sometimes used as well, combining traditional steppe hunting methods with specialized skills of falconry. These hunts were not limited to practical purposes. They were also important social events, where the Mongol elite gathered outside the formal environment of the imperial court. Nobles demonstrated their riding skills, archery, and physical strength while building bonds with fellow members of the ruling class. Observers like Marco Polo described how enormous these hunting expeditions could become. Entire camps travelled with the emperor, including soldiers, attendants, cooks, and servants. The mobile court moved across the landscape like a traveling city. In many ways, the royal hunt symbolized the identity of the Mongol ruling class. Even while governing vast cities and complex administrations, the Mongol elite remained proud horsemen of the steppe. And on the open plains, far from palace walls, they returned to the traditions that had built their empire. If there was one symbol that defined the Mongol elite, it was the horse. Long before they ruled vast cities and commanded imperial bureaucracies, the Mongols were riders of the steppe. Their entire way of life revolved around horses, and this deep connection remained central to court culture, even after the empire expanded across Eurasia. For Mongol nobles, horsemanship was not simply a useful skill, it was a fundamental part of identity. From childhood, boys and girls learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Life on the steppe required mobility, and horses allowed families to move with their herds across enormous distances of grassland. The armies of Genghis Khan owed much of their success to this culture of riding. Mongol warriors were famous for their ability to control horses with extraordinary precision. They could fire arrows accurately while riding at high speed, change direction rapidly during battle, and travel long distances with minimal supplies. Even at the imperial court of Kublai Khan, the importance of horses remained obvious. The Khan maintained vast herds that supplied the court with mounts for hunting, military campaigns, and ceremonial events. These herds numbered in the thousands and were carefully managed by specialized attendants and herders. Horses also played an important role in communication across the empire. The Mongols developed an efficient relay system of postal stations where fresh horses waited for messengers traveling long distances. Riders carrying official orders could move quickly from one station to another, allowing information to travel across thousands of kilometers of territory. For the Mongol elite, horses were also a display of prestige. Nobles often owned large numbers of high-quality mounts, and certain horses were valued for their strength, endurance, and speed. Beautiful saddles, decorated bridles, and elaborate riding gear reflected both wealth and status. Ceremonial occasions sometimes included impressive displays of horsemanship. Riders performed difficult maneuvers or demonstrated their ability to shoot arrows accurately while galloping across open ground. These performances reminded observers that the Mongol rulers were not simply administrators in palaces, they were descendants of nomadic warriors. Travelers such as Marco Polo often remarked on the extraordinary riding skills of the Mongols. To European visitors accustomed to slower cavalry traditions, Mongol riders seemed almost inseparable from their horses. Even as the empire grew more urban and complex, the horse remained the heart of Mongol culture. Without it, the Mongol Empire would never have existed. Among the many elite customs of the Mongol court, falconry held a special place. To outsiders, it might appear to be a leisurely pastime, but for the Mongol aristocracy, it represented skill, prestige, and a deep connection to their nomadic traditions. Hunting with trained birds of prey had long been practiced across the Eurasian steppe, and Mongol rulers elevated the practice into a grand imperial activity. At the court of Kublai Khan, falconry became one of the most admired skills among nobles. Members of the ruling class often kept trained hawks, falcons, and eagles that were used during hunting expeditions. These birds were carefully raised and trained by specialized handlers who understood how to prepare them for hunting in open landscapes. The birds themselves were remarkable hunters. Falcons could dive through the air at incredible speed to strike smaller prey such as birds and hares. Eagles, larger and stronger, were capable of attacking animals like foxes or young deer. Watching these birds hunt across the open plains was considered both impressive and entertaining. Training such birds required patience and expertise. Falconers developed close relationships with their birds, learning how to control them with signals, whistles, and gestures. Leather gloves protected the handler's arm as the bird perched calmly before being released into flight. Falconry also reflected the wealth and power of the Mongol elite. Maintaining hunting birds, handlers, and equipment required resources that only the upper levels of society could afford. At the imperial court, entire teams of falconers travelled with the emperor, ensuring that hunting birds were always available for royal expeditions. According to accounts from observers like Marco Polo, the scale of falconry at the Mongol court could be extraordinary. The emperor reportedly maintained thousands of hunting birds cared for by large groups of attendants. During major hunts, these birds were released across wide areas of open land, creating dramatic scenes as they pursued prey through the sky. Falconry expeditions often took place alongside the larger hunting gatherings that Mongol nobles enjoyed. Riders on horseback followed the flight of the birds, ready to retrieve captured animals or release additional hunters into the air. Beyond entertainment, falconry symbolized the harmony between Mongol rulers and the natural world of the steppe. The ability to command both horse and bird reflected mastery over the environment that had shaped Mongol culture for generations. In the Mongol court, hunting with falcons was more than sport. It was a display of skill, prestige, and the enduring traditions of the steppe aristocracy. Clothing at the Mongol imperial court was more than simple protection against weather. Garments served as powerful symbols of rank, authority, and identity. Among the Mongol elite, what a person wore could reveal their position in the empire's complex social hierarchy. Traditional Mongol clothing had developed on the harsh landscapes of the steppe. Riders needed garments that allowed freedom of movement while remaining warm during cold winds and long journeys on horseback. One of the most common garments was the deel, a long robe tied at the waist with a belt. This design allowed riders to stay comfortable while travelling long distances across open grasslands. Even when the Mongols ruled sophisticated cities, this basic clothing style remained popular among nobles. At the court of Kublai Khan, traditional steppe clothing mixed with luxurious materials gathered from across the empire. Silk robes from Chinese workshops, fine fabrics from Central Asia, and richly embroidered garments became common among members of the ruling class. Colours and decorations often reflected rank. High-ranking nobles might wear robes decorated with intricate patterns or trimmed with valuable fur. Certain garments were reserved for important ceremonies or official gatherings at court. The Mongol rulers also used clothing as a form of political reward. The Khan sometimes presented robes of honour to loyal officials or visiting diplomats. Receiving such a garment symbolized favour from the emperor and could strengthen alliances across the empire. These ceremonial robes became part of a broader system of imperial prestige. By distributing valuable clothing and gifts, the ruler demonstrated generosity while reinforcing loyalty among nobles and officials. Headwear also played an important role in court fashion. Mongol nobles often wore distinctive hats that indicated status or regional identity. Some were decorated with fur or feathers, while others displayed precious ornaments. Despite these luxuries, Mongol clothing never completely abandoned its practical roots. Even the most decorated robes were designed with horseback riding in mind. Wide sleeves allowed movement, belts secured weapons or tools, and layered fabrics protected riders against cold winds. Foreign visitors often noticed this balance between elegance and practicality. Travellers such as Marco Polo observed how Mongol nobles combined the traditions of nomadic life with the wealth of an imperial court. In many ways, Mongol clothing reflected the identity of the empire itself. It blended steppe heritage with the resources of conquered civilizations, creating a style that was both practical and magnificent. At the Mongol court, garments were never just clothing. They were symbols of power worn on horseback. Even after conquering vast cities and building imperial capitals, the Mongol rulers never completely abandoned their nomadic traditions. One of the most distinctive features of Mongol court life was its mobility. Unlike many medieval courts that remained permanently inside stone palaces, the Mongol imperial court often moved across the landscape like a travelling city. This tradition came directly from the nomadic lifestyle of the steppe. Mongol leaders were accustomed to migrating with their herds and households across wide grasslands in search of fresh pastures. When they became rulers of an enormous empire, they adapted this custom rather than abandoning it. During the reign of Kublai Khan, the official capital was established at Kanbalik, the city later known as Beijing. Yet even with this magnificent urban centre, the emperor frequently travelled outside the city with his court. Seasonal camps and hunting lodges allowed the ruler to maintain contact with the traditional lifestyle of the steppe. When the imperial court moved, the scale of the operation was extraordinary. Hundreds or even thousands of people accompanied the Khan. Nobles, guards, servants, cooks, artisans, falconers and administrators all travelled together. Herds of horses and livestock moved alongside long caravans of carts carrying supplies and equipment. At the heart of this mobile court were the large royal tents, or gurs. These structures were far more elaborate than the ordinary tents used by common nomads. Imperial tents could be enormous, decorated with embroidered fabrics and supported by carefully crafted wooden frames. Inside, carpets, cushions, and luxurious furnishings created an environment suitable for the ruler of the largest empire on earth. Despite their grandeur, these tents maintained the essential advantage of portability. They could be dismantled, transported, and rebuilt whenever the court moved to a new location. The mobile court allowed the Khan to maintain strong connections with Mongol traditions. Hunting expeditions, military inspections, and meetings with regional leaders often took place during these journeys across the countryside. Foreign observers were often amazed by the scale and organization of these traveling courts. Travelers like Marco Polo described how the imperial camp seemed almost like a moving city, complete with markets, officials, and ceremonial gatherings. This blend of mobility and imperial power made the Mongol court unique. Even while ruling great cities, the Mongol elite never forgot that their empire had been born on horseback. And sometimes the greatest palace of all was simply a magnificent tent beneath the open sky. By the height of the Mongol Empire, the imperial court had become something unique in world history. It was neither purely nomadic nor fully urban. Instead, it blended the traditions of the steppe with the institutions of the great civilizations the Mongols had conquered. At the center of this world stood the ruler, the Khan. Under leaders like Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan, the Mongols transformed from a federation of steppe tribes into the rulers of a vast and complex empire stretching across Eurasia. Yet despite this transformation, Mongol court customs continued to reflect the culture of the grasslands where the empire had begun. Lavish feasts celebrated the wealth of conquered lands, but they still served traditional steppe foods and drinks. Royal hunts took place on horseback across open landscapes, reinforcing the martial skills that had made the Mongols such formidable conquerors. Falconry and horsemanship remained symbols of elite prestige, reminding nobles of their warrior heritage. At the same time, the court increasingly absorbed influences from the civilizations within the empire. Chinese administrators managed large bureaucracies that governed millions of subjects. Persian scholars contributed knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and trade networks. Merchants from Central Asia helped coordinate the movement of goods across enormous distances. This multicultural environment made the Mongol court one of the most cosmopolitan centers of the medieval world. Languages from across Eurasia could be heard in the palace halls. Diplomats arrived from distant kingdoms bearing gifts and seeking alliances. Foreign visitors were often astonished by what they encountered. One of the most famous observers, Marco Polo, described a court filled with wealth, ceremony, and international diversity. For Europeans who had rarely travelled beyond the Mediterranean world, the Mongol capital appeared almost unimaginably grand. But beneath the layers of imperial administration and diplomatic ceremony, the Mongol elite still saw themselves as riders of the steppe. Their identity remained tied to horses, hunting, loyalty to the Khan, and the traditions of nomadic life. Even emperors ruling from great cities preserved these customs as symbols of their heritage. In this way, the Mongol court represented a remarkable balance. It was an empire built on movement, conquest, and adaptation. A court where silk robes and golden palaces existed alongside falcons, horses, and the enduring spirit of the open steppe. And in that combination of worlds, the Mongol Empire found its unique character.